There is a throne room in Addis Ababa where lions once slept at the feet of an emperor, not metaphorical lions. Real ones. Chained and docile. Draped across the marble floor like living symbols of a dynasty that claimed descent from King Solomon himself, from the union of the biblical king, and the Queen of Sheba, from a bloodline so ancient it predated written history, so sacred it was ratified by God, and preserved across 3,000 years of war, invasion, plague, and the grinding pressure of empires that rose and fell around Ethiopia while Ethiopia somehow endured. The lions were not decoration, they were a statement. They said in this room, ancient things still live. In this room the modern world does not entirely apply. The year is 1930. And Africa is almost entirely a European possession. Look at the map of the continent at this moment. And the colors tell the story with brutal clarity. British red covers enormous swaths of the east and south. French blue dominates the west and north. Belgian, Portuguese, Italian, German colors fill the remaining spaces. The Berlin Conference of 1884. The gathering at which the European powers divided Africa among themselves, with the casual efficiency of men carving a roast, had produced a continent in chains. Indigenous kingdoms that had governed complex, sophisticated societies for centuries had been dismantled, their rulers exiled or executed, their land seized, their people conscripted into labor systems that differed from outright slavery, primarily in name. One country had escaped this fate. One country on the entire African continent, and arguably the only country south of the Mediterranean, had met European colonial armies in the field, and turned them back. In 1896 at the Battle of Adwa, an Ethiopian army under Emperor Menelik I had destroyed an invading Italian force with a completeness that shocked the European colonial world to its foundations. An African army, armed partly with modern weapons acquired through strategic diplomacy, commanded by generals of genuine military sophistication, had defeated a European colonial force in a pitched battle, killing or capturing more than half of its strength. Adwa was not a guerrilla ambush or a tactical advantage. It was a decisive engagement on open ground, won by superior numbers, superior generalship, and extraordinary fighting spirit. It was the largest defeat of a European colonial army by an African force in the entire history of colonialism. And its consequences were permanent. Italy was forced to recognize Ethiopian sovereignty. Ethiopia remained independent while its neighbors were absorbed. But 1930 is not 1896. The world has changed. The European powers have recovered their confidence and their appetite. Italy, humiliated at Adwa, and now under the leadership of Benito Mussolini, the fascist dictator who came to power in 1922, with a vision of restoring the Roman Empire's Mediterranean dominance, has not forgotten the defeat, has not forgiven it, is actively planning its reversal. The intelligence reports reaching Addis Ababa from European capitals in early 1920s and early 1930s carry a consistent message. Italy is rearming. Italy is reinforcing its Eritrean and Somali colonies that border Ethiopia on two sides. Italy is waiting for a pretext and will manufacture one if none presents itself naturally. Into this gathering storm, into this world of colonial pressure and institutional memory and ancient pride and modern danger, steps a man who has spent his entire life preparing for exactly this moment. A man of small physical stature and enormous intellectual force. A man who speaks 7 languages and thinks in the grammar of international law at a time when international law is the only weapon available to a country too poor to match Italy's modern military. A man whose bearing is so precise, whose dignity is so complete, whose sense of destiny is so absolute that foreign diplomats who met him for the first time often reported the same reaction, that they had been in the presence of something singular. His name, the name the world will know him by, is Haile Selassie. It means, power of the Trinity. And before he is finished, the world will know the name in ways both magnificent and tragic, both inspiring and deeply, humanly flawed. He is about to be crowned Emperor of Ethiopia. And the weight of 3,000 years is descending onto his shoulders. He was born Tafari Makonnen on July 23, 1892, in the village of Adrasagoro in the Hara region of southeastern Ethiopia. A place of coffee plantations and highland cool, a region whose multicultural character, shaped by centuries of trade between the Ethiopian highlands and the Somali coast and the Arab world beyond, gave the young Tafari an early exposure to the world's diversity that would mark his thinking for life. His father was Ras Makonnen, one of the most distinguished military commanders and governors in Ethiopian history. Ras Makkonnen had led Ethiopian forces at Adwa. He had been one of Menelik Dai's most trusted lieutenants, a man whose combination of military capability and diplomatic sophistication made him invaluable at a moment when Ethiopia needed both. He had traveled to Italy after Adwa as part of the peace delegation, one of the few Ethiopian leaders with direct, personal experience of Europe, of its cities, its institutions, its power, and its persistent appetite for African territory, despite the defeat at Adwa. He brought these lessons home and poured them, deliberately and systematically, into the education of his son. Tafari's education was extraordinary for an Ethiopian child of his era. His father arranged private tutoring from a French Catholic priest, named Abbé Jeremy, who taught him French, European history, geography, and the basic frameworks of Western political thought alongside his traditional Ethiopian education, in scripture, Ethiopian history, and the ceremonial and administrative traditions of the imperial court. Tafari absorbed both streams with the focused attention of a child who seemed to understand, from an early age, that what he was learning was not merely information but survival tools. He learned languages the way other children learned games, not reluctantly but with genuine appetite, understanding instinctively that the ability to communicate directly with foreigners, without the distorting filter of an interpreter, was a form of power. His mother died when he was 2. The loss was real, but its direct impact on his development was absorbed into the larger loss that shaped his early years: the absence of a conventional childhood, the premature weight of dynastic expectation. He was the son of a great man. He was, by the blood of the Solomonic dynasty, connected to the emperor. He was being prepared for responsibility at an age when other children were simply living. The Ethiopian aristocratic tradition did not regard this as unusual. It was the norm for children of the high nobility. But it produced in Tafari a quality of self-possession that observers throughout his life commented on. The sense of a man who had never entirely been a child, who had grown into adulthood carrying weights that most people never lift at any age. His father died in 1906, when Tafari was 13. The death of Ras Makkonnen removed the primary anchor of his early life, the figure whose protection, guidance, and formidable reputation had created the space within which the young Tafari could develop. Now he was exposed. Now the court politics of Addis Ababa, the intricate, treacherous world of Ethiopian imperial succession, in which legitimate claims meant nothing without the power to enforce them and in which yesterday's ally was today's threat, became his immediate environment rather than his distant future. Emperor Menelik II took the young Tafari under his direct supervision, appointing him first to administrative positions in the Harar region, the territory his father had governed, and then, as his capabilities became apparent, to increasingly significant responsibilities at the imperial court. Menelik was aging and increasingly incapacitated by illness. He was also watching. He was assessing the young men around him, with the experienced eye. Everything the 19th century had thrown at him, and understood that his successor would need qualities that went beyond royal blood. What he saw in Tafari Makkonnen was something not easily quantifiable, but unmistakably present: a quality of patient strategic intelligence, a capacity to absorb the long view in situations where everyone else was reacting to the immediate crisis, a personal dignity that never shaded into arrogance and never collapsed into submission. Tafari was not the most powerful young nobleman at the court of Menelik II. He was not the most militarily renowned. He was not the most militarily ambitious, at least not in the way that ambition usually expressed itself in the Ethiopian court, through displays of force and declarations of precedence. His ambition was quieter, deeper, and far more dangerous to those who failed to recognize it for what it was. He was going to rule Ethiopia. He had known it since he was old enough to know anything. And he was going to be patient about it, for exactly as long as patience served him, and not one moment longer. The decade after Menelik I's death in 1913 was one of the most turbulent in modern Ethiopian history, and Tafari Makkonnen navigated it with a skill that, in retrospect, seems almost preternatural, though at the time it more like survival than strategy. Menelik's immediate successors were not strong. Lijayasu, Menelik's chosen heir, was young, erratic, and made the catastrophic political error of appearing to favor Islam over Ethiopia's traditional Orthodox Christian religious identity. An impression that, whether accurate or exaggerated by his enemies, provided the trigger for his overthrow in 1916. The coup that removed Iyasu was organized by the Ethiopian nobility with the support of the Orthodox Church, and Tafari Makanen was among its architects. He had identified the moment correctly. Iyasu's religious politics had created a coalition of opposition, broad enough to move against him successfully, and attaching himself to that coalition, rather than trying to lead a less supported alternative, was the tactically correct decision. Iyasu was deposed. Empress Zuditu, Menelik's daughter, was placed on the throne as a compromise candidate, acceptable to the conservative religious establishment, and Tafari Makanen was appointed regent and heir apparent, the second most powerful position in the empire, with control of day-to-day governance, while Zuditu provided the symbolic legitimacy of the Solomonic bloodline. The arrangement was inherently unstable. Zuditu and Tafari represented genuinely different visions of Ethiopia's future. Zuditu was deeply conservative, personally pious, temperamentally cautious, resistant to the modernization that Tafari believed was Ethiopia's only defense against the colonial pressure building on its borders. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church hierarchy, which saw in modernization a threat to its own institutional dominance, aligned with Zuditu. The traditional nobility, whose power rested on the feudal land relationships that a modernizing state would inevitably disrupt, aligned with Zuditu. Tafari found himself governing with the formal authority of the regent, but surrounded by institutional forces, committed to limiting what he could actually do with that authority. He moved carefully. He did not attempt to force through reforms faster than the political coalition he needed could tolerate. He built his support base methodically, cultivating the loyalty of younger military officers, developing relationships with foreign governments, establishing Ethiopian embassies in European capitals where none had previously existed, applying successfully for Ethiopian membership in the League Nations in 1923. That League membership was a strategic masterstroke of the First Order. It placed Ethiopia under the nominal protection of the international legal framework that the post-World War I settlement had created, and it gave Ethiopia a platform for international communication and a basis for appealing to international law that would become, a decade later, critically important. He traveled to Europe in 1924, the first Ethiopian regent to visit the European capitals, and the journey was both an education and a performance. He was photographed, interviewed, received at court. He visited military installations and industrial facilities with the focused attention of a man conducting a strategic survey. He saw European cities and European power in a way that confirmed both the scale of the challenge Ethiopia faced and the specific vulnerabilities that a diplomatically sophisticated small power might exploit in the relations between the larger European states. He was 32 years old, dressed in his characteristic military uniform, with the dignity of a man who carried several thousand years of dynastic history in his bearing. The European press reported on him with curiosity and respect. He filed away everything he observed for later use. The opposition to his regency was real and occasionally dangerous. In 1928, a rebellion organized by Dejazmach Balcha Safo, an old guard military commander who despised the young regent's modernizing tendencies and his willingness to engage with Europeans, was diffused by Tafari through a combination of diplomatic maneuvering and the timely demonstration of loyal military force. Balcha marched on Addis Ababa with his army. Tafari had the army's supply lines cut, and its officers secretly contacted with offers of amnesty and reward for switching allegiance. By the time Balcha reached the capital, his army had dissolved around him. He entered the city alone, seeking sanctuary in a church. His rebellion collapsed without a battle, which was precisely how Tafari preferred to resolve threats, through the application of strategic intelligence, rather than military force, which was always expensive, and always created new grievances. He was forcing the pace. After Balcha's failed rebellion, Tafari moved to consolidate his position more formally. He pressured Empress Zuditu into granting him the title of Negus, king, in 1928, elevating his formal status to a level that made the succession question effective. He settled in his favor, regardless of what Zuditu herself might prefer. He was building a political reality on the ground faster than his opponents could adjust to it. He was patient, yes, but patience was a tactic, not a terminal state. When the moment was right to accelerate, he accelerated. The moment arrived in April 1930. Empress Zude died. The circumstances are debated, But the timing was convenient for the succession, and Tafari Makanen became Emperor of Ethiopia. He chose a throne name Haile Selassie I, King of Kings, Lord of Lords, conquering Lion of the tribe of Judah, elect of God. The titles were not ego, they were theology. They were politics expressed in the language of divine legitimacy that the Ethiopian system required. And they were a declaration to the world that the man who had just ascended to the oldest continuous throne in Africa was not a temporary political arrangement, but the inheritor and continuation of something ancient, profound, and, he intended, permanent. The coronation of Haile Selassie on November 2, 930, was designed to be witnessed by the world, and the world obliged. Delegations arrived from across Europe, from Japan, from the United States, from every corner of the international community that could be persuaded to send a representative. The ceremony combined elements of ancient Ethiopian Orthodox Christian ritual with the theatrical grandeur of a royal coronation conducted in the newly completed St. George's Cathedral in Addis Ababa, with an attention to pageantry that communicated, deliberately and precisely, the image Haile Selassie wanted to project. Ethiopia was not a primitive kingdom receiving the civilizing attention of Europe. Ethiopia was an ancient civilization, possessed of its own sacred traditions, its own legitimate sovereignty, its own place in the community of nations, a place it had earned through history, not borrowed from European permission. Among those who watched the coronation coverage with particular intensity were Jamaican followers of a new spiritual movement that had been anticipating exactly this moment. The Rastafari movement, named after Haile Selassie's pre-coronation title, Rastafari, had been building in Jamaica through the 1920s, drawing on the Pan-Africanist teachings of Marcus Garvey, and on biblical prophecy to identify the coming crowned king of Africa as a divine figure, the returned Messiah, the fulfillment of a cosmic promise made to the African diaspora. Haile Selassie himself was not a Rastafarian, and never endorsed the movement's theological claims about his divinity. But the movement's existence, and its eventual global spread, would become one of the most remarkable dimensions of his legacy, separating his historical persona from his historical reality in ways that still generate fascinating complexity. His first years as emperor were consumed with the project of modernization, the urgent, never quite fast enough effort to build a modern state from institutions that had changed little since the medieval period. He drafted and promulgated a constitution in 1931, a document that was more symbolic than genuinely democratic, concentrating power firmly in the emperor's hands while establishing the forms of constitutional government. Critics noted, correctly, that it established a parliament with no real power. Supporters noted also correctly that it established the principle of constitutional governance in a country that had never had one, and that the principle, once established, had a way of developing its own momentum over time. He built schools. He sent Ethiopian students abroad for education at rates the empire had never attempted before. He began construction on roads. Ethiopia's greatest military vulnerability was its lack of infrastructure, which prevented rapid troop deployment and made supply chains for a defending force almost impossible to maintain. He modernized the army with European advisors and European equipment, though the pace of military modernization was never adequate to meet the threat that was building across his borders. He established hospitals. He created the beginnings of a modern bureaucratic administrative system, replacing the entirely personal loyalty-based governance of the traditional Ethiopian feudal structure with something approximating impersonal institutional function. None of it was fast enough. None of it could be fast enough. The Italian threat was not a distant possibility that would materialize in some future decade when Ethiopia had had time to complete its modernization. It was immediate. It was deliberate. It was being driven by a fascist government that had staked domestic political prestige on avenging Adwa, and would not be deflected by Ethiopian modernization efforts, however impressive. Mussolini had decided. The only question was timing and pretext. The pretext arrived in December 1934 at Wal Wal, a desert waterhole near the undefined Ethiopian-Somali border. An incident between Ethiopian and Italian forces, the details of who fired first remain disputed, produced casualties on both sides and gave Italy the diplomatic cover it needed to demand reparations, to escalate, to begin the public drumbeat of grievance and outrage that preceded military action. Haile Selassie appealed to the League of Nations. He invoked the international law that Ethiopia's League membership was supposed to guarantee. He did everything that a small power with a legitimate grievance could do within the existing international framework. The League deliberated. The League appointed commissions. The League produced reports. And Italy built up its forces in Eritrea and Somalia, importing hundreds of thousands of troops, hundreds of tanks, hundreds of aircraft, poison gas, the full arsenal of a modern industrial military machine preparing to fight a country whose army still moved primarily on foot and horseback. The disparity was not merely military. It was civilizational in the narrow industrial sense. The gap between a fully industrialized 20th century military and an army that had changed less fundamentally since 1896 than its commanders cared to acknowledge. Haile Selassie prepared. He could not match Italy's military capability. He could not close that gap in the time available. What he could do was fight and appeal, and survive, and trust that the moral clarity of his position, and the mechanism of international law that the world had solemnly promised to uphold, would eventually produce a consequence that mere military force could not. He was about to discover how much that trust was worth. October 3, 1935. The Italian army crossed the Ethiopian frontier. No declaration of war, no final ultimatum. Just the crossing of a border by a modern industrial military force equipped with poison gas, aerial bombardment capability, and the absolute certainty that the League of Nations, despite its solemn commitments, would not intervene militarily to stop them. General Pietro Badoglio commanded the northern invasion from Eritrea. General Rodolfo Graiani commanded the southern push from Somalia. Between them they brought approximately 400,000 men, 300 aircraft, and a determination to achieve in weeks what they had failed to achieve in 1896. The Ethiopian resistance was fierce, brave, and ultimately insufficient against a military that used mustard gas, delivered by aerial bombing and artillery, soaking the Ethiopian highlands in chemical poison that burned skin and lungs and blinded fighters, who had no protection against it. In systematic violation of every international convention that existed. The Red Cross reported the gas attacks. The League of Nations debated them. Britain and France, the major powers whose commitment to collective security would have required them to impose meaningful sanctions on Italy, chose instead to pursue private diplomacy. The Haile Pact of December 1935, which proposed giving Italy most of Ethiopia in exchange for a nominal preservation of Ethiopian sovereignty over a rump territory. The pact was leaked to the press, and produced an outcry of public revulsion in both Britain and France that forced its withdrawal. But the underlying dynamic it revealed, that the major powers would not sacrifice their own interests to defend Ethiopian sovereignty, was not withdrawn with the pact. It was simply less visible. Haile Selassie commanded in the field. Not from a distance, not from the safety of Addis Ababa, but in the northern highlands, with his army, in conditions of extraordinary physical hardship. He was not a military commander of Menelik's caliber, and the situation he faced, attempting to coordinate the movements of an army with adequate communications infrastructure against an adversary with complete air supremacy, was beyond the capability of any commander to manage effectively. The Battle of Mechu in March-April 1936, the last major engagement before the Italian advance on Addis Ababa, was a defeat. The Ethiopian army fought with extraordinary courage against opponents who used chemical weapons against unprotected troops and bombed medical facilities marked with the Red Cross emblem. The courage was not enough. The emperor returned to Addis Ababa as the Italian advance continued. The debate in the Imperial Council was brutal and binary. Stay and fight to the end, a last stand that would produce certain defeat and almost certain death, or leave, preserve the legitimate government. Continue the fight through diplomacy from exile. The arguments for leaving were practical and compelling. The arguments for staying were emotional and honorable, and also practical. An emperor who fled would hand Italy a propaganda victory that could legitimize the Ethiopian cause internationally. The argument for leaving ultimately prevailed, advanced most forcefully by those who believed that Haile Selassie's personal survival was the only guarantee that Ethiopian sovereignty would eventually be restored. On May 2, 1936, Haile Selassie left Ethiopia. He boarded a train to Djibouti. From there a British ship carried him to Palestine, and then to Europe. The Italian army entered Addis Ababa 4 days later. Mussolini declared the Ethiopian Empire dissolved and annexed to Italian East Africa. King Victor Emmanuel II was proclaimed Emperor of Ethiopia. The lions were gone from the throne room. And then, on June 30, 1936, Haile Selassie addressed the League of Nations in Geneva. He walked to the podium to an auditorium where Italian journalists were loudly booing, whistling, and attempting to disrupt his address. A disorder that the League president was slow to silence and that Haile Selassie waited out with a stillness that the world press noted, and that photographs preserve in extraordinary detail. When silence was finally achieved, he began to speak. In Amharic, his own language, not the diplomatic French that League proceedings typically used, requiring interpretation but choosing the language as a statement. He was the Emperor of Ethiopia, speaking as the Emperor of Ethiopia, in the language of Ethiopia. And the League could accommodate that or not. His speech was one of the most powerful political orations of the 20th century. He described the gas attacks on civilian populations. He described the bombing of Red Cross facilities. He described the systematic violation of every international law that the League existed to uphold. And he ended with words that echoed through the subsequent decades. It is us today. It will be you tomorrow. He was not merely describing Ethiopian suffering. He was diagnosing the terminal illness of collective security. The disease by which great powers, unwilling to enforce the principles they had collectively proclaimed, would enable aggressors one by one until the aggressors turned on the great powers themselves. He was right. Within 3 years, the Second World War had begun. The appeasement that had left Ethiopia to Italian poison gas extended itself to Czechoslovakia at Munich and ultimately failed to prevent the global conflict that Haile Selassie had warned was coming. His prophecy was precise, public, and completely ignored until it was too late to avoid its fulfillment. He spent the exile years in Bath, England, in a house called Fairfield. The years were difficult, poverty relative to imperial standards, the cold dignity of a man maintaining his royal bearing in reduced circumstances. The slow painful watch as the world he had worn slowly destroyed itself in exactly the way he had predicted. And then, finally, the Second World War changed everything. Italy's entry into the war against Britain in June 1940 transformed Ethiopia from a diplomatic problem into a military asset. Britain now had every reason to support Ethiopian resistance, which had never fully ceased, sustained by the Abignok, the Ethiopian resistance fighters who had kept the flame of independence alive through 5 years of brutal Italian occupation. In January 1941, British and Commonwealth forces, combined with Ethiopian resistance fighters and the emperor himself, who had returned to Sudan and was preparing to re-enter his country, launched Operation Compass, the East African campaign that would drive Italy from the Horn of Africa. On May 5, 1941, exactly 5 years to the day after the Italian army had entered Addis Ababa, Haile Selassie rode back into his capital. The symmetry was not accidental. He understood the power of symbolism. The date was chosen. The image of the emperor, returning on the anniversary of defeat, was a statement about the nature of sovereignty and the limits of force. You can take a throne for 5 years, but you cannot take it forever. The restoration of 1941 was a triumph. It was also the beginning of the contradictions that would eventually consume the empire he was trying to rebuild. Post-liberation Ethiopia faced challenges that the rhetoric of sovereign restoration could not fully address. 5 years of Italian occupation had disrupted the existing social order in ways that were not simply reversed by the emperor's return. The infrastructure the Italians had built, roads, buildings, administrative systems, was a mixed inheritance, useful practically, but built by an occupation that had committed atrocities, used slave labor, and massacred Ethiopian civilians in reprisal campaigns that killed tens of thousands. The Ethiopian economy was devastated. The administrative class that Haile Selassie had been building before the war had been killed, exiled, or dispersed. The reconstruction task was enormous, and the international context had changed in ways that complicated everything. Ethiopia in 1941 was liberated partly through British military action, and Britain expected something in return: access, influence, basis. Commercial arrangements that tilted in Britain's favor. The relationship between the restored emperor and his British allies was never entirely comfortable. Haile Selassie was grateful and resentful simultaneously, grateful for the military support that had restored him, resentful of the British tendency to treat restored Ethiopia as a client state rather than a sovereign partner. He navigated this tension with the same patient strategic intelligence he had applied to every other constraint on his authority, publicly cordial, privately determined to establish full independence as quickly as British geopolitical interests would permit. The post-war decades brought both genuine achievement and deepening structural crisis. Haile Selassie emerged from the Second World War with an international prestige that his pre-war exile had, paradoxically, enhanced. His League of Nations speech had been vindicated by events. His personal survival and return had the quality of a biblical narrative. The righteous king driven from his throne, preserved by faith, and restored by divine providence. He was a founding member of the United Nations. He was a founding figure of the Organization of African Unity, when it was established in Addis Ababa in 1963, a moment of genuine triumph. The anti-colonial pan-Africanist dream institutionalized in his own capital, with himself as its elder statesman and symbolic father. He federated and then annexed Eritrea, a decision that produced one of Africa's longest and most devastating wars of liberation, as Eritrean resistance to incorporation into the Ethiopian Empire became the defining political fact of the Horn of Africa for decades, and cost hundreds of thousands of lives. The federation arrangement, established under UN auspices in 1952, gave Eritrea internal autonomy while linking it to Ethiopia in a federal arrangement. In 1962, Haile Selassie simply dissolved the federation and incorporated Eritrea as an Ethiopian province. The Eritrean independence movement that resulted would outlast him, outlast his successors, and ultimately produce an independent Eritrea in 1993, after 3 decades of war that began as a direct consequence of his decision. At home, the contradictions between his role as modernizing reformer and his insistence on absolute imperial authority became increasingly unsustainable. The Constitution of 1955, a revision of the 1931 document, introduced a parliament elected by popular vote, a formal gesture toward democratic governance. But real power remained entirely with the emperor. The parliament could advise. It could not override. Ministers served at imperial pleasure. Criticism of the emperor remained effectively forbidden. The modernization that Haile Selassie promoted, universities, hospitals, infrastructure, diplomatic engagement, was creating an educated class that was developing, inevitably, political expectations that the imperial system was structurally incapable of meeting. The crisis of 1960 should have been the warning. While Haile Selassie was abroad on a state visit, a group of officers of the imperial bodyguard launched a coup, seizing the royal palace, taking members of the imperial family hostage, and announcing over the radio that a new government had been formed under Crown Prince Asfaw Wasson. The coup was suppressed within days by the regular army and the air force, which remained loyal to the emperor. Haile Selassie returned and reasserted control. The ringleaders were executed. Order was restored. But the coup had revealed something that could not be unrevived by its suppression: the existence, within the educated elite that his own modernization programs had created, of a serious political movement that viewed the imperial system as an obstacle to Ethiopia's development, rather than its guarantor. The students who demonstrated in support of the coup's announced aims of reform and development were not foreign agitators or communist infiltrators. They were Ethiopians educated in the institutions Haile Selassie had built, applying the intellectual tools he had given them to analyze the political system he presided over. The analysis was not favorable. He saw the danger. He acknowledged, in ways that his more sycophantic advisors discouraged, that reform was necessary. But the reforms he could bring himself to make were always insufficient, always preserving the core of imperial authority, while adjusting its periphery, always offering the form of participation without its substance. He was a man of extraordinary intelligence, trapped inside a political philosophy that had formed in his childhood, and that his life's entire structure of meaning depended on maintaining. The absolute divine, right monarch could no more reform himself into a constitutional figurehead than he could stop being himself. The contradiction was not resolvable, it could only be deferred. And then the drought came, and the deferral end of 1972-1974 killed an estimated 200,000 people in the Wollo and Tigray regions of northern Ethiopia. The rains had failed. The crops had failed. People were dying in the highlands in numbers that were known to the imperial government, documented in its own records, visible to anyone who traveled through the affected regions. The government did not announce the famine. It did not request international aid in the early months when aid might have dramatically reduced the death toll. It suppressed internal reports. It feared, with a calculus so cynical that it becomes almost incomprehensible, that acknowledging the famine would damage Ethiopia's international prestige, embarrass the emperor personally, and potentially destabilize the political order. People died while the government managed the information about their dying. When the famine became known internationally, partly through a devastating British television documentary in 1973 that juxtaposed footage of starving Ethiopians with footage of lavish imperial banquets, the political damage was total and irreversible. The disconnect between the image of a modernizing, internationally respected emperor and the reality allowed a preventable mass death, rather than acknowledge its own failure, was a wound that no amount of damage control could close. The Ethiopian military, the Derg, a committee of mid-ranking officers, moved against the emperor in a coup that proceeded in slow motion through 1974. A series of arrests and depositions that dismantled the imperial structure piece by piece before finally reaching the emperor himself. Ministers were arrested. The prime minister was replaced. Military officers loyal to the emperor were removed from command. The parliament was dissolved. The imperial court was stripped of its functions. And through all of it, through the months of watching his world be systematically taken apart, Haile Selassie maintained a public composure that observers found either admirable or incomprehensible or both. He was deposed on September 12, 1974. He was placed in a Volkswagen and driven from the palace at home for 44 years, while crowds that had lined the streets to cheer him for decades stood in silence or turned away. He was 82 years old. He offered no resistance. He said nothing to his captors that was recorded with certainty. He was taken to a house in the grounds of the palace and placed under detention. The Derg, led eventually by Colonel Mengistu Haile Mariam, moved Ethiopia toward a Marxist, Leninist state with a speed and violence that shocked even those who had opposed Haile Selassie's autocracy. The Red Terror of 1977-1978 killed tens of thousands of people, students, intellectuals, political opponents, anyone suspected of insufficient revolutionary commitment. The emperor's family and associates were arrested. Many were executed. The institutions that Haile Selassie had built, the churches, the schools, the universities, the diplomatic relationships, were either destroyed or redirected to serve the new ideological order. On August 27, 1975, the official Ethiopian government radio announced that Haile Selassie had died of respiratory failure in his quarters. He was 83 years old. The Derg provided no body, no funeral, no death certificate that independent observers could verify. Subsequent investigation, including examination of remains found under a concrete floor beneath the former palace, produced evidence consistent with strangulation. The Ethiopian government formally acknowledged in 1994, after the Derg's fall, that the emperor had been murdered by suffocation on Mengistu's orders. The man who had addressed the League of Nations with the moral clarity of a prophet, who had survived exile and returned in triumph, who had built a modern state from a medieval kingdom and governed it for half a century, died alone in a room with no witnesses, murdered by the people who had taken his throne and buried in secret under a floor. His body was exhumed in 1992. He was reinterred with imperial honors in the Holy Trinity Cathedral in Addis Ababa in 2000, in a ceremony attended by hundreds of thousands of Ethiopians and representatives of the global Rastafari community, who came from Jamaica and Britain and the United States and every country where his name had become sacred. 25 years after his death, the world was still arguing about what he had been. In Kingston, Jamaica, on any given Sunday, in churches painted in red, gold, and green, with portraits of a small Ethiopian man in military uniform on the walls, and the scent of incense in the air, congregations sing hymns to a God who once walked the earth as Haile Selassie I, King of Kings, Lord of Lords, conquering Lion of the tribe of Judah. They are Rastafarians, and their faith, born from the collision of Marcus Garvey's Pan-Africanism and Ethiopian imperial history in the impoverished yards of colonial Jamaica, has spread to every country on earth, producing a global spiritual community that numbers in the millions, that generated a musical tradition in reggae that became one of the most influential popular music forms of the 20th century, and that gave the name and the image of an Ethiopian emperor to generations of people in the African diaspora, who had never set foot on African soil, but who found in the idea of Ethiopia, of an undefeated African kingdom, of a divine African king, a counter-narrative to the colonial story of African inferiority that had been used to justify centuries of slavery and oppression. Haile Selassie himself, when Rastafarian pilgrims came to Addis Ababa in the 1960s to pay homage to their living God, was reportedly disturbed by their veneration and urged them to, through intermediaries, to convert to Orthodox Christianity, the faith he himself practiced with genuine and deep conviction. He did not claim divinity. He was, by his own understanding, a Christian monarch ruling a Christian empire by divine appointment, but not himself divine. The gap between what he was, and what millions of people believe to be, is one of the most extraordinary paradoxes in the history of religion, and it has not narrowed in the decades since his death. The historical assessment of Haile Selassie does not resolve into a simple verdict. It cannot. The same man who was Africa's pre-eminent anti-colonial voice was himself an internal colonizer, an Amara emperor who suppressed Oromo, Somali, and Eritrean identities within Ethiopia's borders, who used the same logic of civilizational hierarchy that he condemned when Europeans applied it to Africans. The man whose League of Nations speech remains one of the great moral orations of the 20th century presided over a government that allowed 200,000 people to starve rather than damage its prestige, by acknowledging their suffering. The modernizer who built universities and hospitals, and students abroad for education maintained a political system that could not accommodate the political expectations that education inevitably generates. These are not reconcilable contradictions. They are simply the contradictions of a human life, lived at the intersection of history's most dramatic forces: colonialism, Pan-Africanism, modernization, tradition, the claims of divine right monarchy against the demands of democratic governance, forces that no individual, however gifted, could fully navigate without being shaped and damaged and ultimately broken by them. What is not contradictory is the 1936 speech. Whatever the failures of his governance, whatever the human costs of his political decisions, whatever the moral complexity of his long reign, the man who stood at the League of Nations podium in Geneva in June 1906 and spoke to indifferent power, while Italian journalists booed him from the gallery, was doing something that required not merely political courage, but a kind of historical clarity that very few people in any era possess. He saw what was happening. He named it. He told the world what would follow, if the principles it had proclaimed were abandoned in practice. He was right about everything. He was ignored by everyone. And then he was proven right by a world war that killed 50 million people. The Organization of African Unity, now the African Union, still meets in Addis Ababa, in the city he built, in the institution he helped to found. The African Union's founding principle of respect for colonial-era borders, however imperfect, however the product of European imposition, rather than African self-determination, was Haile Selassie's contribution to African political order. The recognition that the alternative to accepting flawed existing borders was a continent of permanent border wars, and that a flawed stable order was preferable to a principled permanent chaos. It was a pragmatic position. It was also, in its own way, a form of wisdom. Ethiopia today is a country of 120 million people, the second most populous in Africa, navigating the same tensions between tradition and modernity, between ethnic identity and national unity, between authoritarian stability and democratic aspiration, that defined Haile Selassie's reign and destroyed it. The Tigray conflict that erupted in 2020 killed hundreds of thousands of people, and involved the same highland region where Haile Selassie's forces fought their last battles against Italian invasion in 1936. The patterns of Ethiopian history repeat themselves with a persistence that suggests something deeper than coincidence: structural forces, geographic realities, the ethnic compositions that outlast any individual ruler and resist any individual solution. The Holy Trinity Cathedral in Addis Ababa, a marble tomb, an imperial coffin. Hundreds of thousands of Ethiopians who came to witness a reinterment in the year 2000, came not all to mourn, not all to celebrate, but to be present at the closing of something. The last emperor of a dynasty that had lasted 3,000 years returned to the earth of the country he had governed for half a century. His extraordinary life finally completed by the burial he had been denied for 25 years. Outside the cathedral, In the streets of the city he had built from a highland encampment into a capital, the city whose name means new flower. In Amharic, the traffic moved and the market noise rose and the ordinary miraculous business of a living city continued without pause. As it always does. As it always will. In Jamaica on Sunday mornings the hymns continue. In Geneva, the text of the 1936 speech is still studied in international law courses as a case study in the use of moral authority when material power has failed. In Ethiopia, the question of what Haile Selassie was, emperor, modernizer, oppressor, visionary, failure, prophet, is still debated with the intensity of people arguing about someone whose shadow still falls across their present. He was the last emperor. He was also many other things, some of them magnificent, some of them damning, all of them human. He lived for 83 years, and he occupied more of history than most countries manage in a century. The lions are gone from the throne room. The throne room itself is gone, converted to other purposes by the government that killed him. But somewhere in the red, gold, and green fabric of a Rastafarian flag, somewhere in the recording of a reggae song, played in a bar on a Caribbean island, somewhere in the deliberations of the African Union meeting, in the city he built, somewhere in the memory of a people who are still, 3 generations later, sorting through the inheritance he left them, he persists. History does not release the people who shaped it. Not even the ones that buried under a floor in the dark.